Recently, I came across a book called The Vivisector, published in 1970, and it was written by an Australian author called Patrick White. And it's an interesting story about an artist who likes to paint portraits of people, but he is particularly nasty, really, in the fact that he loves to discover some kind of flaw. And once he observes that in their daily lives, he then creates a picture of them where that particular flaw or human weakness really stands out. When his subjects happen to see the portrait he's been working on, they feel really shocked and ashamed and offended. The name of the artist in the novel is Hertel Duffield, and he kind of defends his work to himself by saying he's interested in depicting the truth. And the truth is not some, as what he calls like aesthetic truth, which means some beauty. For example, the art of the ancient Greeks loved depicting the ideal of the human form and ideal scenarios with the pagan gods and what have you, but the beauty of the human form and beauty in art was what they were about. Duffield is like, no, that's not truth. The truth is sleazy and ugly. These are a couple of quotes that Patrick White has put in. This one is from William Blake. Cruelty has a human heart, and jealousy a human face. Terror, the human form divine, and secrecy, the human dress. And this is a quote from St. Augustine. They love truth when it reveals itself, and they hate it when it reveals themselves. So Duffield sees the truth of humanity being the worst of humanity. He sees himself as a vivisector, a person who dissects things to find out what's all going on in there. And that's what he does with his portrait painting. He psychologizes people. He psychologically dissects them to try and find the nugget of sleazy reality or weakness or ugliness, and that's what he decides to depict because that's what he sees is the truth. And I thought this was a good metaphor for what we do when we look at the world and look at people through the eyes of the ego. We are searching for a particular nugget of guilt and shame that we then focus on and make a portrait out of it so that we can immortalize that negative thing we see, put it on the wall so not only ourselves can look at it, but so can everybody else. That part of our ego that needs to see evil and shame out there so that we don't connect with the idea that it is in our mind. It is our own identification with shame and guilt that we are suffering from. So I thought that Duffield's keen eye for the weakness and the so-called ugliness in people, I thought that really relates well to a section in the Obstacles to Peace in the course. It talks about how we're attracted to seeing guilt in other people when we have identified with guilt in ourselves. And what we do is we actually look for it out there. We look for any scrap of evidence of something connoting weakness, vulnerability, bad behavior, anything that says that person is not a holy son of God or a child of God. So I'm going to read out a section from the Obstacles to Peace now. Relationships in this world are the result of how the world is seen, and this depends on which emotion was called on to send its messages to look upon it and return with word of what they saw. Fear's messages are trained through terror, and they tremble when their master calls on them to serve him. For fear is merciless even to its friends. Its messengers still guiltily away in hungry search of guilt, for they are kept cold and starving and made very vicious by their master, who allows them to feast only upon what they return to him. So there's some really metaphorical language here. Jesus in the Course is himself painting a very vivid picture here to get across what the ego in us is doing when we've identified with fear. We will send out messages, the hungry dogs of fear, in what he now will call a savage search for sin. No little shred of guilt escapes their hungry eyes, the messengers were sent out. And in their savage search for sin, they pounce on any living thing they see and carrying it screaming to their master to be devoured. Wow, so not only are the messengers portrayed here as being quite gruesome and, scary, so is the master. So is the person or the ego that sends these messages out. That ego is just waiting to devour the sin that these messages bring back. And so it is. When we are identified with the ego and with fear, we are starving, craving those messages of sin that can be found out there. We are all like Hurtle Duffield, wanting to get those messages and paint a picture to memorialize for eternity this person's or group of people or nation, whatever you like, their weaknesses, their sin. So carrying on with that section from The Obstacles to Peace, keeping up that really vivid imagery, here's some more of that picture Jesus is painting. Send not these savage messengers into the world to feast upon it and to prey upon reality, for they will bring you word of bones and skin and flesh. They have been taught to seek for the corruptible and to return with gorges filled with things decayed and rotted. So, in other words, in less explicit and flowery language, our messengers or what we're seeking out there are indications that people are just bodies, are just egos, are just what Freud would say, man is wolf to man. So Freud only saw people as their egos. He saw the bad in people, but he thought that's all there was. And when we are identified with the ego, that's all we want to see. We want to only see the indicators to us that that person is also identified with a body and identified with their ego, because look at how they behave. They must be a body. And that is satisfying to our ego. If bodies are real, the world of separation is real, our special individual self is real. So now we have the contrast coming in to that section again in the obstacles to peace. What if we weren't like Hurtle Duffield? We weren't identified with the ego and looking out for what we perceive is the truth in others because we've perceived it as the truth in ourselves. Weakness, viciousness, anything associated with the ego. Then we send out love messages if we are identified with the Holy Spirit. Love's messengers are gently sent and return with messages of love and gentleness. The messengers of fear are harshly ordered to seek out guilt and cherish every scrap of evil and of sin that they can find, losing none of them on pain of death and laying them respectfully before their Lord and Master. Perception cannot obey two masters, each asking for messages of different things in different languages. What fear would feed upon, love overlooks. What fear demands, love cannot even see. So this brings me to a film called The Painter and the Thief. I think it's a great illustration of what it's like to be an artist who looks for something different in their subject. It's a documentary based upon a man who stole 2 paintings from a gallery, and in court, the artist who painted those paintings wanted to know why he stole the painting, and she also just wanted to know where is it. It was one of her best paintings and she wanted to retrieve it. First of all, he said he stole the painting because he thought it was so beautiful. Second of all, he didn't know where he put it. It wasn't at his home. He doesn't know what the two of them, him and the other guy, he doesn't know what he did with it. Neither does the other guy. They were just so out of it. Then the woman asks, he wants to make some reparation for what he did. And she said, well, you could sit for me for a portrait. And he goes, okay. And so he does. And there's a scene in the film where there is the unveiling, and it's very touching. One, for the portrait itself. As you can see, it shows a very thoughtful man wearing his reading glasses, and it just seems really peaceful and reflective. And when the picture was revealed and the guy, the thief, saw it, he became overwhelmed. He cried, he sobbed, and here's a picture now of him as he's standing up looking at the painting. The artist then just gave him a hug because he was so distressed, and I think you can see the emotion on his face. What he then went on to describe is he was like, you saw that in me? You saw me that way? He couldn't believe that the artist saw him with what I see as this aura of gentleness and peace in the painting. And in the documentary, she then speaks to the camera and she says, there's just no way I could see the thief in this guy. And I think that's just a lovely parallel to Hertel Duffield and what he sought to portray in people. So going back to that line that I just read previously from the course, what fear would feed upon, love overlooks. What fear demands, love cannot even see. So that brings me back to her line. There's no way I could see the thief in that guy. So she had got to know him a bit while she was painting the portrait. And really the fellow that was before her, she couldn't even imagine him committing a crime. Reflecting on these 2 kind of portraits, the one created by the woman of the thief and the ones that Hertel Duffield created, made me think of a passage from James Joyce's memoir, The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. In it, there's a discussion of what is proper art. And he says that proper art, there's no longing for the object, but there's also no repulsion, no aversion to looking at the object. So in Hertel Duffield's paintings, there was a revulsion in looking to the subject matter. With the portrait we've just seen of the thief, I really feel that kind of depicts what Joyce is describing as proper art. There's no longing. So in Joyce's words, it's not pornographic. It doesn't create a desire in the viewer for what is there, but there's no aversion to what is there either. There is just what the thief actually experienced when he saw it, that an aha, a moment. Joyce calls it aesthetic arrest, where you're just met with the power of the picture. And I would say it's the beauty, really, of the picture, in that you connect with it. You connect with it. You don't desire, doesn't create desire, and it doesn't create aversion. There's just a connection, and that is what is beautiful about it. I think this idea of aesthetic arrest that Joyce talks about helps describe what it is to see through the Holy Spirit's vision rather than the eyes of specialness. So when we're identified with the ego, we'll be in a search to fill ourselves up with something because we'll feel deficient, not being a part of oneness, not being a part of wholeness. And we'll also be in a search for people that we can project and things we can project our guilt onto to get rid of a sense of sin, also associated with not feeling a part of God's oneness. What that means is we'll be, in the Buddhist terms, all about desire and loathing. So when we talk about the art again, we're desiring the object or we're loathing the object. So that's all about specialness. We do that with art objects, pieces of art. We also do it with people. In Jung's memoir, Memories, Dreams and Reflections, there's a lovely passage where he's talking about a vision that he had of his wife after she died. And it really speaks to how we meet something from that place of wholeness in ourselves and see the wholeness in someone else as well, and how there is no desire or loathing or specialness when we have identified with wholeness ourselves and can therefore perceive the wholeness in someone else as well. So here is what Jung says about that vision or dream of his wife. I saw her in a dream, which was like a vision. She stood at some distance from me, looking at me squarely. She was in her prime, perhaps about 30, and wearing the dress which had been made for her many years before by my cousin, the medium. It was perhaps the most beautiful thing she had ever worn. Her expression was neither joyful nor sad, but rather objectively wise and understanding, without the slightest emotional reaction, as though she were beyond the mist of effects, affects, meaning emotions. I knew that it was not she, but a portrait she had made or commissioned for me. It contained the beginning of our relationship, the events of 53 years of marriage, and the end of her life also. Face to face with such wholeness, one remains speechless, for it can scarcely be comprehended. The objectivity which I experienced in this dream and in the visions is part of a completed individuation, which means coming to a sense of wholeness. It signifies detachment from valuations and from what we call emotional ties. In general, emotional ties are very important to human beings, but they still contain projections. And it is essential to withdraw these projections in order to attain to oneself and to objectivity. Emotional relationships are relationships of desire, tainted by coercion and constraint. Something is expected from the other person, and that makes him and ourselves unfree. Objective cognition lies hidden behind the attraction of the emotional relationship. It seems to be the central secret. Only through objective cognition is the real coniunctio possible. What he means by coniunctio is the real joining, and through that, the real experience of wholeness. Now, I think projection is what the ego uses to keep aspects of ourselves away from our own awareness and from our own experience. As with the discussion of James Joyce's, proper art, I think what Jung is describing isn't an absence of feeling at all. It's describing what it feels like to feel a connection with something without neediness. So without that desire to get and without that aversion or loathing. So that's, I think, what he means by that objective cognition. You see, you experience the person, but there is an intimacy there. And really, according to the Course, there can only be intimacy when there isn't any specialness. when there isn't any desire to get or any aversion. Because if that is there, then what we're responding to is our ideas about someone, because those things, desire and aversion, relate to what we are projecting onto somebody else. So there is no meeting when they are present anyway, even though we might be full of emotion, of desire, or loathing to get away from. We're not meeting with anything. And this brings up the course's section on Beyond Symbols. It says, you have decided that your brother is a symbol for a hateful love, a weakened power, and above all, a living death. And so he has no meaning to you, for he stands for what is meaningless. So what the Course is saying here, by juxtaposing these opposites, hateful love, weakened power, living death, is that when we are identified with the ego and the thought system of specialness, we will both love and hate in specialness terms. Our hate is, well, what we all know is hate is projection of our guilt and shame. And the love of the ego is all about, it's all based on getting what we feel we need to make ourselves feel good. So it's a love that's asking for something. And the real love, you know that it's real love. Love doesn't ask for anything, the Course says. Love is all about extending. But the ego's love is very needy. So when we're experiencing that, we're not seeing the person at all. We'll be painting all sorts of portraits about them. We'll be a Hertel Duffield. we'll paint all sorts of bad portraits. And then some other days we'll paint all sorts of good portraits, maybe if we're not Hertel Duffield, but somebody else. But neither of these portraits representing the person at all. They're just representing what we need to see in someone else. So really, like the Course says, and so that person, when we're seeing them through the eyes of specialness, has no meaning. He stands for what is meaningless. We're just seeing them as a body. The picture of your brother that you see is wholly absent and has never been. Let then the empty space it occupies be recognized as vacant, and the time devoted to its seeing be perceived as idly spent, a time unoccupied. An empty space that is not seen as filled, an unused interval of time not seen as spent and fully occupied, become a silent invitation to the truth to enter and to make itself at home. For what you leave as vacant, God will fill, and where He is, there must the truth abide. And so the first replacement for your picture is another picture of another kind. A bit later on, forgiveness is the means by which the truth is represented temporarily. Temporarily meaning just while we're here. It lets the Holy Spirit make exchange of pictures possible. The picture of your brother given you to occupy the space so lately left unoccupied and vacant will not need defence of any kind, for you will give it overwhelming preference, nor delay an instant in deciding that it is the only one you want. So if only we could experience that other picture, the Holy Spirit's picture, before we make the choice to see it, then we would know that we would be better off choosing it. But until then, we need to take a bit of a leap of faith. We need to say, well, look, I would be better off if I was wrong the way I'm perceiving this person, and that I don't want to be experiencing the feelings that I am experiencing right now. Once we can say that, we can say, I'd be better off if I was wrong. And so that opens our mind to the Holy Spirit's influence and being able to perceive a different picture, another picture, one that sees beyond the person's body, which in real terms means we don't see them as sinful. We don't feel the hatred towards them anymore. So, with all of this in mind, I'd like to close with a section from The Dreamer of the Dream. And whenever you find yourself just stuck in perceiving someone in a particular way, in painting a particular portrait, you can think of these lines and maybe it will help motivate you to choose another way. So here are those lines. Dream softly of your sinless brother who unites with you in holy innocence. And from this dream, the Lord of heaven will himself awaken his beloved Son. Dream of your brother's kindnesses instead of dwelling in your dreams on his mistakes. Select his thoughtfulness to dream about instead of counting up the hurts he gave. Forgive him his illusions and give thanks to him for all the helpfulness he gave. And do not brush aside his many gifts because he is not perfect in your dreams. He represents his Father, whom you see as offering both life and death to you. Brother, he gives but life. Thanks for watching and tune in again. Bye.